Sure, it's not news now, but it's still important. Trump has won the presidency in the American elections, beaten Kamala. A few people might be maybe not sleeping so well at night or getting a bit upset. There's quite a long list. I'll give you the list, and then maybe you could help us unpick what is going on. Yeah. So NATO, he's had a pop at them. What I call the under 2%ers, he's had a go at them. Zelensky may not be too happy, given the budget issues that Trump has mentioned. Then we got Putin, both as far as Ukraine's concerned and generally in the relationship, and obviously China as well. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, well, where do you start? We're literally assimilating the news at the moment, aren't we? As we record, it's very topical. You and I end up talking a lot more about some of the other aspects of this election, but the bit for the podcast really is just, what are going to be the implications? This isn't just about American politics, it's about global politics. President Zelensky, I'm not sure he'll be sleeping as well tonight, because we've got to wait and see what President Trump actually does. The rhetoric is one thing. I've said before that sometimes what he says, you just want to slap him a bit. But the reality is a lot of what behind the scenes, a lot of what he does makes sense. But he has talked about potentially solving the war in Ukraine. That's not going to be great. The 2%ers.
So on day one.
Well, he did say, didn't he? Within 24 hours, I'll have solved the war.
Don't forget, so he gets inaugurated in January. So he's actually got a couple of months to sort of work it out.
Yeah, but even so, after my recent visit there, I think most people are going to be But the fact is, are we going to see an upswing in support from America, or is it likely to be tempered? I think, unfortunately, the latter. I think the 2%ers, before Trump started wailing about it, 2/3 of NATO were not spending the 2%. It's now down to 1/3. But if I was those third, I'd be going, really?
Sharpening my pencil.
Sharpening a pencil a bit. Will he walk away from NATO? Betting money on the table? I don't think so. But will he get America to focus more on China and leave Europe to focus on Russia? I think that's far, far more likely. And therefore, what's that going to have the impact for our own defence review? That actually, rather than just sitting under the NATO umbrella, probably the West is going to have to step up a little bit more to the Trump. And the one we didn't really mention was Netanyahu. So out in Gaza, the last year, I've seen America's the guarantor of security for Israel, and yet that should come with a few leashes on Prime Minister Netanyahu. For the last year, Netanyahu seems to have been operating autonomously, and the voice of America has not been very effective at reining in some of his actions, largely because I suspect President Biden felt more and more constrained as the election approached. I suspect now President Trump is going to look a lot more at that. He's going to put a firm set of leads, I suspect, on Netanyahu. And that probably explains why Netanyahu's doing everything he possibly can to do as much as he possibly can before that date in January.
Do you think they got a good relationship, Netanyahu and Trump?
I'm not so sure that it's all about relationships. I know people, Trump had a relationship with the North Korean leader, didn't he?
Well, he said he did. And
then he called him that little man with a red button or whatever it was called. And he sort of went, I'm not sure. I think Trump will take his obligation seriously. But the bottom line with Trump, it's America first. And that sounds bad, but actually every country operates in their own national interests. And I think, what does that mean? For taxpayers and voters in America, that means putting more money in their pocket. That might have implications for America's posture, its foreign policy, its approach to so many of these challenges around the world. That would be interesting to see.
Well, I got two more questions for you then.
Uh-oh.
Slightly off the core subject. Tulsi Gabbard was a Democrat. She's a stunning politician, very powerful, veteran, big on defence. I wonder what's the best thing that she'll play a role, may even be defence sec.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if there'll be new appointments across the board. I think it's one thing being good at military. There's not many ex-military folks who do startlingly well as politicians. And Ben Wallace did in this country. But arguably, are you prepared to make the difficult calls? Because your heart is largely with the military rather than actually with the politics behind this. She has been a very compelling figure, and it will be interesting to see how much there is a genuine military mind approach to Ukraine, to China, to Israel and the Gaza, versus a purely political stance.
Yeah. Will be interesting to watch because the way it works in America is once you have got through this 5th of November, you then get budget to set up your new team. Actually, what Trump has been doing is spending his own money, quotes his own money, prior to the 5th of November. So he was that confident. He's actually done a lot of work to build the team. Now, obviously, we don't know all the answers. We know potentially some of them. So we might know the answer to that question actually quite quickly, because obviously defence, for the reasons you've said, is going to be a major issue for him.
Well, I think because he's made some promises, hasn't he, about this, certainly about Ukraine. It makes me shudder, to be brutally honest. I mean, when I went out to Ukraine, their view was, this is 300 years of fighting. You're not going to solve this in 24 hours. But Trump loves to do a deal. That's part of his brand.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot more to these conflicts than simply putting a sticky plaster over and calling it peace.
Sure, the curveball question for you. Related to Trump, if you're David Lammy, do you think you're going to be Christmas Day eating your turkey still in the same job as Foreign Secretary?
I think there's some really interesting questions. It's not just about the Foreign Secretary, it's also about the Prime Minister. If you look at what he's said about President Trump in the last year or so, it hasn't all been complimentary.
Not really.
And therefore, but I noticed the note that was sent across from Sir Keir Starmer across to the new president, wishing him well, lots of bonhomie and positive narrative. But if it's about relationships, you talked about relationships earlier, that's not going to go off to the best of starts, is it?
No, quite. A little while ago, we got genuinely worried that North Korea was now bringing troops to bear to support Putin in the Ukraine war. I think we've learned something else about the quality or the status of those troops, haven't we?
We have. It's been rumbling for a while, but America this week has confirmed that there's up to 10,000 North Korean troops have been doing training in Russia, certain military equipment that they've been using from the West. But it's also quite interesting because they kept saying that these were high quality, not quite special forces, but they're elite forces from North Korea. That would have been a worry that they were being introduced. It's worth pointing out, though, a couple of things have emerged this week. First of all, they haven't been involved in war since 1953. So they have no military experience. More worrying, though, is apparently a lot of those forces are emaciated. They're not fed properly. And one of the things you think, okay, is that really true? A story emerged that back in 2017, a North Korean soldier managed to try and escape from North Korea, made his way across the armed zone, got shot several times, but survived. South Korean doctors treated him for his bullet wounds. But they found a massive 27-centimetre intestinal worm in his body, a load of other parasites and stuff like that, all of which, horribly malnourished, was because apparently they eat a lot of corn and don't have a balanced diet. And you sort of take it for granted that soldiers particularly are normally well-fed because you need them to represent your country. So I think there's no doubt that those North Korean soldiers will feel proud. They think they're representing their country overseas. The worry is if they get used on the front line and they're emaciated and they don't speak the language and they're not battle-hardened, how are they going to return home? Not on their feet.
Well, that's really interesting. Of course, there's the other factor that you mentioned before, which I think has something to do with being a soldier in a dictatorship where you're basically taking orders, and that seems to constrain your ability to perform, both from a point of view of the latitude you've got, but also the time it takes for command to flow down and back up and so on. So is that still a factor in your mind?
It is a bit. Well, I understand now that of the 10,000, apparently 500 officers were sent and a small handful of generals. But none of that solves the command and control, the language issue, the training issue, and how they're actually going to perform on the battlefields. And I think the worry is that there's even been some reports of Russian soldiers going, how are we going to use these guys? And if you're feeling that, you don't want yourself to be put at risk. You're going to be pushing these bodies at risk. And the slight worry, which we don't know the background to, is that how do you stop them all fleeing? The North Korea's soldiers escaping. Apparently their families have all been collected together, probably to stop them talking. But in a more sinister way, you imagine just how these soldiers were briefed. Don't run away, don't escape, because if you do, your family's going to pay. And therefore, it feels like they are on Operation Certain Death. And that just is a horrible way North Korea won't care. They're gaining currency, they're gaining influence, they're gaining weapons help and potentially help with their nuclear program. Putin won't help. It's more soldiers to throw into the mix. The poor individuals that are caught in the middle of this, that's the people to feel sorry for.
Well, sometimes in life, if you put more into something on the basis that it might make it work better, sometimes it doesn't work as well because you create chaos, particularly if people are speaking a different language or got different rules of engagement and, different doctrine and so on. So, it could make it worse.
I'm almost certain, as a military guy, Russia's not famous for using clever tactics and technology. That's why they've called it a meat grinder. They've just been throwing bodies, losing a hell of a lot of people. It's very difficult to see how North Korea is going to step that up. It's almost certainly it's going to make matters worse. They're going to be just thrown in at the meat grinder. And it's also not clear whether they're going to be focused on in Ukraine, or there are reports that they're focusing on Kursk region to help push the Ukrainians out. But however you do it, they're going to be on the front foot. They're going to be exposed. They're going to be out of the trenches. That all spells disaster.
Sean, you mentioned Kursk. We've not heard much about what's going on, but sadly, Russia has begun to retrieve some of the land it's lost. What's the update?
Yeah, it's not been in the news because of the elections and stuff like that. But if you go down to the Donbass region, the Russians are still pushing forward. But we had a view then that by the start of winter, that Russia would have aimed to take the whole of the Donbass. That's why they were pushing hard. Now, we've got some maps to show how they are making progress, but they're nowhere near. They've almost stalled now. And it does appear that they're moving troops up to try to push the Ukrainians out of that Kursk region. We've not heard much about it, but again, there's a couple of maps to show comparisons that there's quite a lot of ground being retained by the Russians. The interesting bit of the story, though, is that Russia has been using conscripts for some of that battle. A load of conscripts have been captured. They're not known for being well trained. And actually, Russian law prohibits conscripts from being used on foreign adventures. And in fact, right at the start of the war, President Putin declared we're not allowed to use conscripts in the war, and I promise we will not use them. The very next day, some of his Russian generals went, some of these guys are being used on the front line. Putin threatened to prosecute them and damage them. But it turns out now that under Russian law, Russian men have to serve 1 year in the military before they're age 30. That ends up with over 280,000 each year getting. But by law, after 4 months of that 1 year, they can be used under special circumstances on the front line. But why it's been interesting is some Russian families who are seeing the body bags coming home are saying, our young men shouldn't be being used. You said they weren't going to be used. They're now returning in body bags, and they're now starting petitions to stop that happening. Now, Russia at the moment...
That's a brave thing to do.
At the moment, Russia's saying, they are they're not loyal to Russia. But
well, the families
are complaining. Putin is declaring them as to being not loyal to the cause. But it's just fascinating. It shows how the delicate line that Putin's having to tread about not mobilizing more people, because there is an undercurrent in Russia that's genuinely not happy about the level of the casualties. And he's got to be quite careful. That's almost certainly another reason why he's using North Korean soldiers.
Okay, so he's scraping the barrel, conscripts and North Korean soldiers actually trying to get land back in Kursk as well.
Yes, and I think, so if I was Putin at the moment, I'd be going, Trump he was gambling, but if Trump comes in, he's going to solve the war in 24 hours. He won't be in post until January. I've got between now and January. And if he's going to stop the war, it's going to be a negotiation. If Ukraine has any Russian territory, that'll be a negotiating strategy. Therefore, one of my priorities...
Scramble,
get them out of Kursk before we enter a negotiation. Now, I don't know, but that seems very likely that's why Putin is pushing hard.
Sure. So if you can join the dots on this one. So 4 people in Poland were arrested because they were being accused of sending incendiary devices through the post, actually using DHL. And a few people have got some conspiracy theories have expanded from this. What do you think?
Yeah, they hit the news this week, and I was asked several times about it because these 4 people that were arrested, it was in Poland, so it was not in this country, and there was a suggestion that Russia was testing how to use DHL to send incendiary devices. Actually, part of the reports were explosives. It wasn't explosives, it's incendiary devices across to America and to Canada. Very, very worrying. And the next thing was they turned around and said, well, back in July, in a DHL warehouse in Birmingham in the UK, that caught fire. And apparently that was due to an incendiary device. Join all those dots, and suddenly the media was going, this is right.
Big story.
Yeah. The trouble is, again, from a military perspective, and I think it sits to what we do on Red Matrix, you go, I can't see, first of all, why Russia would want to send incendiary devices in DHL packages. Secondly, is that, remember that piece that you brought up about the battery? What was the
little motorcycle had caught fire.
Yeah.
And it was like a bomb.
It was dramatic.
Very, very dramatic, yeah.
Those batteries, when they go off, are significant. Any pressure changes can cause batteries to leak slightly. And these days, I don't know about you, but I regularly have Amazon deliveries. There's stuff being moved around. Now, is all of that's battery powered, are all the batteries to the same standard of safety? Possibly not. And it's quite possible that these are batteries going off because they are of substandard battery or haven't been handled properly. I don't know, but I do think it was interesting. This story went from being a couple of fires to suddenly Russia now doing some Machiavellian plot to send stuff out. It might be.
But it might be, because had somebody told us about the pager opportunity before it happened, I think we might have said that's sort of science fiction. And yet Israel worked out that this was a good way of targeting the leaders of their opponents. So maybe it's quite possible that Putin's got a plan, and we just can't quite work out yet how you get these things into strategic locations so they can do their damage.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's less likely to be Russia, though, to be blunt. So we've been talking about Iran and a lot of their proxies. They are funding proxies all around the world that are going to be trying all sorts of really weird and wonderful things.
Retribution.
Yeah, but just trying things out.
Yeah, sure.
And you remember the pagers one, it wasn't the batteries necessarily just spontaneously catching fire. They were apparently loaded with explosives and then timed to go off. And they actually, rather than just setting fire, they exploded and killed some people, didn't they? So again, the part of the paranoia is that half these battles and wars we think are happening a long way away, that we support Israel against Iran. Iran's got proxies. They might well decide they want to have a go at us. And that's why I think we've got to be well aware. And that's why we have security organizations in this country. They thwart a lot of these activities. You've got to stay on top of them. And therefore, this could well be a Russian plot. All I'm saying is that it also might not be.
Sure, Moldova has just had elections. Two primary candidates, one looking east, one looking west. The lady looking west has won. And apparently, you feel there's some skullduggery going on with money from outside of Moldova, from Russia, bribing people to vote in, one way or another. They didn't quite get the result they wanted, did they?
No, they didn't, but it's fascinating. If you look at geographically, we've got a map where Moldova sits. It's right next to Transnistria, which is still Russian-controlled. Russia has all sorts of reasons to try to get Moldova more focused towards Russia. And there were lots of reports of cash, large amounts of cash, being brought across the border into Moldova, and people blatantly being offered money for their vote. What's really interesting, there have been two votes, one of which is Moldova going to join the EU or not? That was razor tight. And the second one was who was going to be president. And again, that was a bit less tight. What's fascinating about Moldova, though, there's about 2.5 million people who live in Moldova. There's also 1.5 million expats. In other words, a significant chunk of people living outside the country. The people who lived inside the country, the majority of those voted in the pro-Russia way, because by all accounts, 300,000 people apparently were taking cash bribes for their vote. More difficult to influence the expats. When you folded in their vote, it meant that Moldova actually voted to join the EU and voted a pro-Western president. But I think there's all sorts of stories about an oligarch there, a Russian oligarch, who's apparently been used $39 million of his own money to try to influence the vote. Now, what caught me interesting about this story, though, is that we just had other elections, most recently in America. And whilst I'm the first...
And in the UK as well.
Well, and the UK. I'm the first to criticise, Russia and Putin for just moving sackloads of money around and buying votes. Actually, is it completely different to what we do in the West? Because, for example, we've seen Elon Musk putting $1 million a day into Trump's coffers, potentially going to secure a cabinet post at the end of it. Trump has been putting on buses to help people get to the voting. And more importantly, both parties are saying, we're going to put more money in your pockets, voters. You'll be better off under us. Now, except it's not quite the same as cash. But is it really that much different?
Well, without declaring how I voted in the UK elections, I was promised by Sir Keir Starmer that as a pensioner, I'd be better off. I'm actually worse off. But did that make me want to vote for him? That's my secret, not to tell. Going on to the wider point. So, yeah, Elon Musk put a lot of money into Trump's campaign. And lots of other people, celebrities gave money. Apparently Bill Gates gave Kamala Harris $50 million. So I guess the big question is, where does money come from to host an election? It's very expensive in America. Under the rules, that's allowed. Under the rules, you can pick people up in your car, you can bus them. In the UK, we do it. When late in the day, they go door knocking. Have you turned out to vote yet? Can we help you? So all those things happen. You're not allowed to bribe people to say, I will give you this money, you vote this way for me. Also, you're not allowed as a foreign nation to go to another nation and interfere with their election process. Now,
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are clear rules about it, but I think in terms of principles, I was just fascinated because I was abhorred by, Putin is clearly trying to influence elections all over the place, and 300,000 out of 2.5 million resident Moldovans, over 10%, giving them a large cash lump, and they wouldn't accept the lump unless they were prepared to vote. So you buy the votes. That is incredibly worrying.
That is worrying, yeah.
But I say, as you said, the way that elections are funded, it relies on private money in the West to do that. Not all of it stands as close as scrutiny as perhaps we like. All of it. People don't generally give money unless they want something in return.
Yeah, quite.
But I think Musk, as we've discussed before, probably has an aim and an objective for supporting President Trump.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows? Yeah. Well, why did the unions give the Labour Party money? Sure, this is the stuff of films. 20 darkly clad IDF Marines landed in a rib on the beach, and within 4 minutes captured a guy, Imad Hamas, captured the guy, took him away, all in the space of 4 minutes. Does that sound real to you, or?
It sounds incredibly daring. First of all, it wasn't in southern Lebanon, which is where we've seen most of the ground forces operate. This was in northern Lebanon. So it would have been shark-infested custard on the ground for the Israeli forces. They wouldn't have known where the enemy were. So it would have to be an incredibly intelligence-led operation. And as we've seen, I think, for the last few months, just how impressive Israel's intelligence is, almost certainly guided by, remember those pager attacks and all of that stuff? What the military used to do was to target comm systems, to force your enemy onto a different comm system that you could more easily track. And I suspect everything we're seeing to do with Hezbollah at the moment is they have had their command and control destroyed, and therefore they're now easier to track. But even so, 25 IDF soldiers, dead of night, in and out, speeding patrol boats, getting them on and off. If I was any of the Hezbollah leaders now, I'd be just worried about where'd you go? Where'd you turn? What do you... and I just want...
What do you have to stop doing so that you don't give away where you are?
Well, exactly. And also, with Benjamin Netanyahu, I predict that he is pushing as hard as he possibly can, because he knows that come January, almost certainly the new President Trump will put a very firm leash on him. So he's got between now and then to deal with the remains of Hamas, to do whatever he needs to do to degrade Hezbollah as far as he can, to potentially go after operatives in Syria, potentially go after the Houthis as well. And he will be, I suspect, going full bore, using all the intelligence they have. If I was any Hezbollah leader, I'd be very worried for the next 2 months, because if they can do this, goodness knows what else they can do.
Well, apparently the guy was commander of at least part of Hezbollah's missile program, and had some quite interesting documents on him as well. So it would be interesting, probably quite hard to find out, but interesting whether the IDF knew that that's what they'd be capturing, as well as the guy himself.
I wouldn't be at all surprised, and it leads on to the other story that I think that you picked out this week, which was that a mosque that the Israelis found was packed full of Hezbollah weapons, rockets, and also sniper rifles and all sorts of things like that. I mean, this is all southern Lebanon, of course, which is incredibly dangerous, difficult work for the Israeli Defense Forces. They've claimed ever since the start of the conflict that Hamas has been hiding under hospitals, that have been hiding weapons under mosques. They've said the same about Hezbollah, but it's very difficult for them to prove it. We've criticised BBC, haven't we, about being dragged into trying to prove this stuff. The video footage that we've got, the IDF inevitably were making a big thing of this. Did they find that intelligence from some of these other documents that have been picked out? Is it human intelligence? I don't know. Is it true? It's quite difficult to position all of these weapons into somewhere where you're in the middle of enemy territory. Obviously, southern Lebanon will have been more...
Need to carry them in and deposit
carry them in, put them in, cover them up. I'm not saying it's impossible, but a lot of this imagery we're seeing is outside, and therefore it's in the public eye. So I think, you'd have to, at face value, the Israelis are uncovering, and there's no doubt, let's be clear, I've no doubt as a military guy, Hezbollah has got a lot of rockets, a lot of weapons, and they're storing them all over the place. Israel's probably barely touching the surface of it.
Okay, this little bit of film from the whole set is of a no-recoil rifle. I've never heard of that before. No doubt you can tell us what that is.
Yeah, I'm not an expert at these things at all, but one of the problems if you're going to do some sniper shooting is that for anybody who's ever done any shooting, you're trying to squeeze the trigger, but the moment that bullet goes off, you get a recoil and it pulls the gun up. And because you're anticipating that, the danger is that the last fraction of a second, it distorts where the round is going to go. If you can have a recoil-less rifle, then you pull the trigger, but the gun doesn't recoil against you at all. Now, some, certainly larger bore rifles, unless you hold them pretty firmly in your shoulder in the military, they get a kick and they can really hurt you. That causes you to flinch just before you pull the trigger. And inevitably, that means, particularly for long-range shots, they're going to be less accurate. So a recoilless rifle is a really very clever way of optimizing your effectiveness, particularly at long-range shots.
We're going to have a bit of fun at the expense of Kamala Harris. She did lose. Most people, when they talk about why, they talk about the big issues, inflation, cost of living, the migration issues, the big things that swing an election one way or another. I discovered a couple of things which I thought were quite interesting and possibly really big blunders by the Kamala Harris program. The first is, as we can see from this little film,
around the Christmas tree at the Christmas party hop. Mistletoe hung where you can see every couple tries to stop.
How dare we speak Merry Christmas? How dare we?
Well, guess what? We're saying Merry Christmas again.
She's basically telling us we're not allowed to say Merry Christmas. Now, I wonder how many people in America that really pissed off for some deep-seated reasons, some of them being religious as well. That's one. The second one is the Amish people in America live in a very concentrated region of North America. and they don't particularly vote, so they're not particularly political. But for some reason, Kamala Harris decided to piss them off. They got more excited, so they registered to vote. Now, the thing that obviously escaped Kamala Harris is they live in Lancaster County, and Lancaster County is in which state? Pennsylvania, which is the big swing state in America. So very close to the final election, she pissed off a huge constituency in a major swing state. It wasn't clever, eh?
We generally try and keep clear of politics, don't we? But I think given it's just after it all, I think inevitably there's going to be a lot of inquests now as to why it was lost, who made mistakes either way. And I think it's easy to look at both the candidates. I mean, let's face it, Trump has been quite a divisive character as well. And if he had lost, I think you could look at a litany of things. I listened to a couple of narratives around this that basically talked about two things. One of which is that most people in the middle ground, not the people who are always going to vote Kamala Harris or always going to vote for Trump, but the middle ground, they generally, historically, vote with their pockets. Has the economy felt like it's been good to them, in which case they support the government, that they feel it's not been good to them, in which case they vote in the opposition. Loads of people in this country did exactly the same thing and were natural Labour supporters. And the history shows that it's very difficult to get re-elected if people don't feel good about the economy, and they didn't. The second reason they talked about was America's a strange environment. They haven't had a female president yet, and there were questions about, first of all, remember the first black president? There was lots of, is America ready for that? And then is America ready for the first female president? And I think there'll be lots of inquiries about whether that actually was also a factor. Harsh reality is, though, I think that whatever happened, America is a bastion of democracy. It was a very lively contest, down to the wire. Trump is now the new president. The first challenge he's got is to heal the nation, to stop this division infecting the rest of their politics. And I think it's, in a way, it's a celebration, even though both characters from this side of the pond have more than their fair share of flaws. I have to say, if you look at what we did in our election and the postscript to ours, I don't think we've got anything to stand and shout about either.
Yeah, good, Sean. So you're a military analyst, now you're a political analyst as well.
Oh, I try and keep clear. I told you.